Second talk of the day is going to be Vijay Veerabadran from University of California, San Diego. I'm very excited for this talk. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Tijl. Can you hear me fine, and can you see the slides on full screen? I mean, the poster on full screen? Good, okay. So yeah, really excited to be talking about our work here. This is work that I've done with my advisor, Professor Vijay at UC San Diego Cognitive Science. So let me go ahead and start off right away. So essentially, the hypothesis that we're exploring here is that cortical recurrent computations are crucial to enabling certain perceptual grouping routines that are lacking in traditionally feed-forward deep neural networks. So, I mean, as we've seen, there's this huge wave of deep learning that which is hard to miss, and predominantly most of these neural networks are feed-forward in nature. They don't really have these recurrent connections built into them. And by virtue of that, they're not super parameter efficient, and they're really data hungry. And by adding these recurrent computations in, which are sort of inspired by cortical computations, what we're trying to do is we're trying to sort of bridge the gap between human perception and machine perception a little bit. So essentially, we develop a convolutional recurrent architecture called V1net. Since the computations of V1net are inspired by sort of these recurrent connections, recurrent horizontal connections, which are inhibitory, excitatory, that are sort of found to be taking place in the primate early visual cortex area V1. And so we create this sort of recurrent unit that is inspired by cortical horizontal connections and merge it with a convolutional long short-term memory unit, which is a standard recurrent cell that people use in the machine learning literature. And we get this unit called V1net. And I'm happy to go into the details of the equations, but essentially there are three different cell types. There are inhibitory and excitatory horizontal connections, which are both linear and nonlinear, which essentially modulate the bottom-up representations that are fed into this unit. And essentially, V1net is modular in the sense that it can be plugged into any standard deep neural network that operates on static images. So it essentially promotes the sort of the serial grouping ability of standard convolutional deep neural networks. And as we said, we are evaluating this model that we introduce on two binary classification problems that are inspired by traditional psychophysics, visual psychophysics tasks that involve contour integration. The first one of which is called MarkedLong. Over here, I'm showing two different images, one from the positive class and another from the negative class. If you look at MarkedLong in any static image, there are multiple paths of varying lengths. So there's exactly one path that is longer than the remaining paths, this one in this image over here. And there's also exactly one path that is marked with this sort of a red bar. And the problem that the model has to solve is to detect whether the longest path in the scene is also marked with this red bar. So in the positive example, that's the case. This red bar is on one of the segments of this long path, which is longer than the rest. And in the negative example, one of the shorter paths is marked with this red bar, as opposed to the longer bar over here. And the next problem that we evaluate this model on is called Pathfinder. This is proposed by Lindsley et al. In 2018. And the task is of very similar nature in the sense that this also tests whether models can do low-level grouping, right? And in a positive example, in Pathfinder, two circular disks are connected by one single long path. And in the negative example, two circular dots are disconnected, right? So just to recap, we have this horizontal connections model that we're going to evaluate on these two visual psychophysics-based binary classification problems that we know are that we know that humans are really efficient in solving. Right? So for this comparison, we systematically compared this V1net model with horizontal connections with 15 other feed-forward and recurrent architectures. These colors correspond to the architectural families of models that we compared. So we compared standard feed-forward neural networks, which are the blue bars over here. And in each color, essentially, as we go from left to right, we're essentially comparing models that have very low hierarchical processing all the way to the right, where we have really high hierarchical processing. So there's more depth, right? So essentially what we skimming over some of the necessary details, which I'm happy to go into detail about in the Q&A, is that we compared these feedforward neural networks with small receptive fields, feedforward neural networks with larger receptive fields, other recurrent neural networks, which are shown in orange here, and standard over-parameterized deep neural networks with orders of magnitude more parameters. And essentially what we found out is that on both these tasks, the task performance accuracy and the learning speed of this V1net circuit, which is recurrent with horizontal connections, is matched only by these reddish bars, which are these very deep feedforward neural networks, which have between 16 and 50 layers of processing, but a V1net block has just one layer of recurrent horizontal processing. So essentially the takeaway is that by adding these recurrent inhibitory excitatory horizontal interactions, this one layer deep shallow recurrent convolutional neural network is achieving the expressivity of these really deep 16 to 50 layer feedforward neural networks at a fraction of the number of parameters. And on the bottom over here, we're showing comparisons of accuracy versus number of parameters. And ideally, we would want to have really high accuracy with really low parameters. So the top left of this plot is sort of an ideal zone. And as you can see, this purple box is the V1net block, which has a really high accuracy on both tasks while having very few parameters. And again, on sample efficiency, which is a corollary for learning speed in terms of the number of samples that the model uses to learn tasks. Again, V1net is the smallest or the most compact model with a really high sample efficiency. So the model is very quick at learning these tasks. And another comparison we did was basically to train a model on one of these tasks and transfer to the other task. And turns out on this sort of transfer learning as well, this V1net model with recurrent connections is really, really compact. We're achieving a pretty comparable accuracy to a bunch of other models. Lastly, so we wanted to test whether adding these bio-inspired recurrent connections actually produces models that sort of create solutions to these problems that are interpretable to humans. And so we basically went in and did sort of an in-model in silico electrophysiology, wherein we looked at what different hidden units were doing with this recurrent processing. And essentially in each of these rows, in the top rows over here, we're looking at the response of a particular hidden unit across time when it saw this particular input image. And at the bottom though, we're looking at a different hidden unit, say. And essentially what we found is that in a very human interpretable fashion, the bottom row is essentially tracing the longest path with different steps of processing. So it's essentially, there's a mutual excitation of this particular red bar that's sort of creating an enhanced spot over this red bar with more and more recurrent processing. And that's what's happening over here as well. And the top row hidden unit, essentially what we found was doing was it was essentially grouping the longest path and the marked path into two different groups, as you can see, with this dark patch and this bright patch, respectively. So essentially, once we looked into what the V1net horizontal connections were doing, it was also creating these really neatly interpretable solutions that are sort of natural to humans as well for these grouping problems. So stepping back into the hypothesis, we wanted to explore whether adding recurrent connections that are inspired by cortical computations essentially enhances the grouping ability of standard deep convolutional networks, and if it biases sort of parameter efficiency and sample efficiency. And our results are showing in a promising fashion some evidence that this one layer recurrent V1net is sort of matching the accuracy and complexity of very deep neural networks that have multiple fold and orders of magnitude more number of parameters in hierarchical processing. I'd like to stop there and if there are any questions, happy to answer them. But yeah, thank you so much. We would be, we would like to acknowledge the Kavli Institute of Brain and Mind at UCSD for making this research possible, as well as the Google Cloud TPU team, who have been very gracious with the resources that they've provided us to be able to carry out this massive study.
Thank you, Vijay. Please join me in saying excellent presentation. And we have a question. We have a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
We have one from Zoom admin, which is a pseudonym for Patrick, and question is, why does CoreNet do so badly on sample efficiency, as it feels like the two architectures are related?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So just a sort of a little more detailed context, these two tasks are extremely difficult to solve. Each of these tasks is 1 million images each, and the shapes of these parts are very wiggly, so the task is really difficult by itself. That's one, and it's surprising that CoreNet and all other models are doing as well as they are. But one critical difference between CoreNet and the V1Net block is that the CoreNet does not have any cell type diversity. It doesn't have these built-in inhibitory excitatory connections that can sort of selectively group and ungroup different contour elements per se. And that's crucial to solving the task. We need to sort of not only group segments of the path that belong to a single path, but we also need to sort of selectively inhibit clutter in the background. So that's possibly one reason why the CoreNet does not match the performance of V1Net yet. But it might be interesting to sort of add these connections to CoreNet and see if that improves performance. But that's a nice question. Yeah.
Thank you. And another question from Robert is, how well do you expect this architecture to generalize to other visual classification tasks?
Yeah, that's a very nice question as well. And it's sort of providing a segue into sort of what we're currently doing rigorously and what we're planning to do next. So we've evaluated this V1Net model on object boundary detection, which is a very relevant task, wherein the input image is just a natural RGB image, and the output is basically a per pixel classification of whether the pixel belongs to an object boundary or not. So it looks like a sketch of the image itself. And in this problem, we find similar results wherein a really compact, shallow V1Net model is able to match the accuracy and sample efficiency of state-of-the-art boundary detection methods. And more recent studies that we're doing right now are basically plugging this into like standard deep networks and seeing if they perform as well on image classification. But yeah, I'd be happy to sort of talk more about that. Yeah, if that's interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question from Patrick. How does it perform on naturalistic data, for example, segmentation tasks?
Yeah, I think this also relates to the previous question, essentially about how well the model generalizes to sort of natural computer vision tasks. So essentially, yeah, for boundary detection, it does work really well. And boundary detection is sort of maybe an easier segmentation-like problem, wherein you don't necessarily classify if the pixels belong to different objects, but you just say whether the pixels belong to an object boundary or not. But on this task, at least, we're seeing promising results with this V1Net architecture. Yeah. There are a couple of preprints on this work. So there's more information on the performance of this particular network on naturalistic tasks in these preprints as well.
Oh, that's great. So
to submit the model on brain score. Not yet, but that's something that we would have to do as well. Yeah. Brain score, if I am correct, is this sort of score that compares the model's relevance to biological data across different experiments, I believe. So yeah, we do plan to submit our model to the brain score metric as well.
This was also one of my questions, was how does it compare to human performance? I have no intuition on how humans perform on this task, but maybe if you put them under pressure, you might get some easier and harder problems that you can.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, we haven't really thought yet of a psychophysics study for this, wherein we measure like time-restricted humans to do these tasks, but that would inarguably be really interesting. Yeah.
I think people would also may also be very interested in the preprints that you mentioned. So you can if you
oh yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So one of the preprints is right over here. Wait, let me just add a link on the chat. So is it good if I just put this here?
Yeah, but you have to select panelists and attendees. So I just went to the panelists.
All panelists and attendees. Let me just copy the title as well. Yeah. If there's any more questions that I can answer outside this talk, feel free to please email me. I also have my email here.
Yeah, that's great. So thank you, Vijay, and thank you, Wei.